So good evening and welcome to everyone. My name is Andrew Cooper. I work, I was going to say here at the Tavistock, but none of us are actually there. We're everywhere else but the Tavistock, and I work at the Tavistock. And I'm going to be chairing and facilitating this evening's event. I'm going to explain the format for tonight, and then after that I will hand over briefly to Mike Smith, who is managing the technical processes this evening, and he'll just have a few words to say. So the process for this evening is this. Helen Morgan, who I'll introduce in a minute, will speak for about 45 minutes. We will then take a break for 5 minutes just to allow people time to get a drink or take a comfort break. And we'll then reconvene for a plenary discussion. We can't use breakout rooms because the size of the audience prohibits that with our Zoom facility. In the plenary, I will be asking for reflections, observations, responses, experiences you've had during the course of the talk, but not questions. The aim is to facilitate a discussion, and I will attempt, or maybe you can yourselves attempt to sort of guide these into a connected conversation. And that links to the ethos of these policy seminars here at the Tavistock. The ethos is really that there isn't an expert in the room. Everybody can think about the topic under discussion. The presentation is food for thought and for feeling. And so the discussion is as important as the presentation. Now, during her talk, Helen is going to be showing images, and we invite you to open yourselves to these and to your feelings and your other experiences as you listen. But during the discussion, you can post thoughts in the chat, but if you want to speak, we're asking you to use the raised hand function on Zoom, which Mike will explain in a moment. Obviously, there are a very large number of people present, nearly 600 as I'm speaking, so only a small proportion will be able to actually contribute to the discussion, but everyone can participate through active listening and engagement. So, Mike, I just wonder if you would run through the technicalities for this evening, please. Thank you.
Yes, certainly, everybody. Sorry. Touch out of breath as the doorbell inevitably went 3 seconds ago, just before I was asked to speak. Yeah, so my name is Mike Smith, and I'm doing the tech support for this evening. And as Andrew said, there will be the talk in the first half, and then sorry for the heavy breathing, an opportunity to reflect later on. So for the first half, the chat function will be disabled. And after a few minutes, we'll also lock the room because we don't want people coming in halfway through the talk. You want everybody to have the full context and understanding of everything that's been discussed. But if your connection drops out or something like that, which does happen and you find it's locked, you're welcome to send an email to communications at tavi-port.nhs.uk, which I will put in the chat here. And then if you email me, I'll try to reopen the room just for a couple of seconds to let you back in and then relock it. So after the break, we'll have our plenary session in which the chat will be open. You're welcome to have your reflections and that kind of thing in the chat there. We won't be asking people in the typed chat to speak. So if you want to speak on camera or using your technology, then please raise your hand using the Zoom functions. Depending on your device, your raise hand button will be somewhere, either down in the reaction section or within the participants area. And then once you've spoken, if you could lower your hand afterwards, that'd be very helpful. And Andrew, he'll go through the raised hands and unmute you, giving you ability to speak in good time. So we're having a short 5-minute break in the middle between the two sections. Please don't log off, as I say, the room will be locked. So just either turn off your camera and as you go for your comfort break. But yeah, if you stay in for the entire thing, that'll be very, very helpful. And I think that is it from me.
Right, thanks so much, Mike. Well, this evening's seminar is a repeat of the event we held back in November, I think it was, last year. And that was attended by around 750 people. But subsequently, I gather the video of it was viewed by several thousand. Well, the huge interest in the idea of whiteness, a problem for our times, is noteworthy in itself, as part of a wave of concern, engagement, and activism around race relations in our society that the Black Lives Matter movement has mobilized. A focus on whiteness and the psychological and political work that this construct does asks those of us present who are white to turn our gaze and our capacity for inquiry towards ourselves. Now, this, I think, is necessarily discomforting, involving what Helen later refers to as an effort to try to break through the comfort zone that occupancy of the privileged category of whiteness affords us. But we want to create a space tonight in which such discomfort can be safely felt, thought about, reflected upon. And of course, all participants are later invited to contribute to the discussion phase. Well, Helen Morgan has been thinking and writing about these matters for many years. She's a Jungian analyst and has led more than one UK psychotherapy organisation in recent years. And she's a fellow of the British Psychotherapy Foundation. Her book, The Work of Whiteness, A Psychoanalytic Perspective, will be published this year, later, in about May, I believe, and a flyer for it will be made available during this evening's event. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Helen to make her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And good evening, everybody. I want to start by just reminding everyone of the title of the talk, which is Whiteness, a Problem for Our Times. The focus throughout is on whiteness as both a construction and a lived experience, and then I argue that it is indeed a very real problem. For Black people, certainly, but also for we white folk. In the Western world, whiteness is regarded as the default position, the norm, and hence difficult to see, and has only become a matter for inquiry relatively recently. For many of us, such an examination can be a new and sometimes uncomfortable experience, and it is understandable that we seek ways of defending ourselves against what can be experienced as accusation. Tonight, I want to offer some thoughts and ideas on the matter, and I invite those present who see yourselves and who are seen by others as white to stay as open as possible to the images, feelings, and thoughts that arise in your mind as you listen. It is a subject where we need to engage thought and feeling, but also imagination. So in order to help with that process, I'm going to use slides throughout, and I hope you find them helpful. It also means you have something else to look at besides me. Okay, here we go, technology. Does that come up for you, Andrew? Yeah. The talk will last about 45 minutes and it's divided into 3 parts. In the first part, give a general discussion about whiteness, its history and its meaning. Then the concept of whiteness in relation to child development, how whiteness is learned. And then some thoughts on what work we might do to bring about change. So, no, why isn't that working? Okay, thank you. So whiteness. The concept of whiteness as applied to humans is full of paradox and contradiction. No human being, even the fairest amongst us, has skin that is actually white, just as the darkest is not black. Yet this crude form of colour coding, which came into being in the modern era, has divided humanity and ensured white supremacy in the service of domination, colonialism, slavery, and capitalism. The deliberate use of this division for political and economic advantage was first recorded in 17th century Virginia, when the first Africans were forcibly brought on slave ships to work the plantations. Anxious that the indentured European labour force would find common cause with the enslaved Africans, the term white was used to transform the masters, plantation owners, and European labourers into one all-inclusive group. Through a set of laws that privileged whites alone, any class solidarity with the blacks was disrupted, ensuring that power remained in the hands of the ruling white elite. Gathering all those with lighter hued skin within the rubric white in the emergent piecemeal way that this occurred, not only allowed the illusion of common privilege, but also tapped into our unconscious imaginary in relation to white and to black. These associations, albeit with some local variations, tend to be universal, based as they are in the nature of our bodies and the diurnal rhythms of the planet we inhabit. Mother's nourishing milk and father's productive sperm are white. Bile and shit are black or brown. White is associated with daytime, the dove of peace, and the pure soul, whereas black belongs to the dark terrors of night, to war and sin. Devils inhabit the blackness of hell, and angels the whiteness of heaven. Link those with a lighter hue of skin to whiteness, and the others to blackness, and much of the psychological work of justifying domination is done. Whiteness implies purity and allows no contamination, no tincture, or it ceases to be white. We are whitewashed, drained of our colours, and all imperfections are located elsewhere. The creation of whiteness forces blackness into existence and turns distinctions of shades into oppositions. Since white cannot allow darkness to exist within itself, shadows must be rejected and cast into what is deemed to be black. In the words of James Hillman, white casts its own white shadow. This conclusion might be better to say, white sees its own shadow in black. Not because they are inherently opposite, but it is archetypally given to whiteness to imagine in oppositions. The category of whiteness, like that of blackness, includes within it an infinite variety of lived experiences of and relationships to the concept. The line that is drawn separating the two has shifted across history and geography, leaving behind a variety of legacies. Many here today will have ancestors who themselves were oppressed and discriminated against. A person of Irish, Southern European, Eastern European, or Latin American descent, or those who are Jewish, Muslim, or from minority religious groups, will have their own historic background of suffering and oppression. Indeed, there have been periods in times and places when each of these groups have been designated as non-white or black. Those who have grown up in societies with a colonial history carry a different collective cultural shadow than those who haven't. Some countries have experienced high levels of immigration from previous colonies, and others hardly any at all, so that their white citizens have had little direct experience of living within a diverse population. The existence of the plantations and of institutionalized chattel slavery for several hundred years in the Americas leaves a different legacy than that inherited by us, the descendants of the European men who ran the trade. Few of us trace a direct hereditary line back to slavers, yet here in the UK, we live our lives amongst the concrete legacy and profits of that trade. There are also political and ethical differences within the white group. Some experience discrimination on the basis of gender, class, sexuality, language, disability, etc. These personal histories and experiences are important and to be honoured, and it is for each individual to find their own relationship to their ancestors and to their life story. And yet, whatever our personal history, wherever we were born, into which class, however young or old we are, if we walk the world as white, we inherit an advantage denied those regarded as black. The term white privilege, whilst important, is also, I believe, problematic in that it can be taken, sometimes defensively, as a denial of the very real deprivations, monetary, physical, and emotional, that some white people clearly suffer. Many white people have to bear the results of discrimination due to class or sexuality or gender or disability. Nevertheless, we do so without the added burden of having to experience the daily grind and violence of racism. In the UK, black people are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white people, and black infant mortality is twice as high. Black people are twice as likely as white people to be unemployed, and almost half of black households live in poverty. Black people are 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people, and 4 times more likely to be arrested. We who are white do not fear the forces of law and order in the way a black person does. Doors are not closed to us because of our skin colour. We see ourselves reflected in places of power and influence and can take for granted a basic social justice across all our institutions, from health to education to the law. We may, if we wish, remain disinterested in racism itself and have the choice to ignore or even deny its presence in the world we inhabit. It is the fact that we are not disadvantaged in these ways that black people are that leads me to stay with the term white privilege for the purpose of this essay. Facing the implications of being white is not comfortable, and we can seek ways of delinking ourselves from this phenomena, often through a form of exceptionalism. I echo Robin DiAngelo's plea in her book on white fragility, that when we face our whiteness, we need to set aside our sense of uniqueness. This, she says, is a critical skill that will allow you to see the big picture of the society in which we live. Individualism will not. For now, try to let go of your individual narrative and grapple with the collective messages we all receive as members of a larger shared culture. Work to see how these messages have shaped your life, rather than use some aspect of your story to excuse yourself from their impact. It can be argued that the very use of the concepts white and black is a way of perpetuating a false binary, and they need to be dropped. It would indeed be a great achievement if we were to reach a point where such terms become meaningless. But that seems a painfully long way away. In the meantime, I argue that to deny the terms is to deny the reality of a form of classification and injustice which needs to be faced at an individual and collective level if we are to get anywhere with creating a fairer, kinder society. Such a denial offers a shortcut that avoids such work and reflects and reinforces the tendency we white people have to not see either our whiteness or our racism, perhaps best summarised as a colourblind position. From the evidence that has emerged from the analysis of DNA, it is now clear that the term race is a constructed concept with no objective basis in biology. The division of the races was created for economic and political purposes, and it is a deep, entrenched social structure which creates and promotes white advantage, and is one within which we all live. No one can be free from it. The statement, "I am not a racist," is meaningless in such a system. This awareness of the deeply embedded aspect of the racist system is essential if we are to get anywhere with understanding and changing it. Linda Ulkoff writes, "Whiteness is lived and not merely represented. It is a prominent feature of one's way of being in the world, of how one navigates that world, and how one is navigated around by others." She goes on to suggest that we tend to reject group concepts in order to maintain the idea that we have control over our identity. She says, "Being identified in a way that lies beyond our individual control conflicts with individualist ideas and illusions about our autonomy. The real concern with race may be less the faulty presumptions about genetic difference than the fact that this is a social fact about us with social meanings and implications over which we have limited agency. People of colour have largely come to accept this. For whites, the forcible interpolations of their racial identity are more often a new experience." As Adrian Harris puts it, to turn to a deconstruction of whiteness is to make the unremarkable remarkable, to force unexamined assumptions, to open up a set of questions. The goal, of course, is to see whiteness as a social construction, to see that whiteness is the unmarked category, and in that particular way accrues and hoards power. Psychoanalytic understandings of how racism operates, focusing as they do on the dynamics of splitting, projection, and introjection, whilst useful to an extent, tend to reinforce the individualism that liberal white people prefer, as Ulkoff describes. We are more comfortable thinking in terms of the individual racist act, which we can then condemn and dissociate ourselves from. In his explorations of the archetypal uses of whiteness, Hillman points out that the concept also implies attributes that are not so positive. White also represents what is ashen, pallid, colourless, blank, lily-livered, cowardly. He also writes of white as but a blank and ignorant page, the requisite stupidity at the start. The philosopher Charles Mills refers to the inverted epistemology he calls white ignorance, which he suggests produces the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. Ulkoff describes this concept as a set of substantive epistemic practices designed to protect their belief that society is basically a meritocracy, people of colour are responsible for their troubles, and racism is a thing of the past. Just as D'Angelo stresses that white fragility is not a weakness, but a way of protecting white advantage, white ignorance is the means by which we at the centre close our eyes to our privilege and the impact on those at the margins. By staying blind and unknowing, by assuming racism, disparity and prejudice belong to the past or to other individuals, we manage the tightrope of relieving ourselves of guilt whilst ensuring the advantages of our whiteness are maintained. We, who I refer to as white liberals, can dwell in this ignorance. Our racism is of a cordial variety, which conceals the violence within, which we project onto avowed white supremacists, failing to see how we are linked. Martin Luther King wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his strike towards freedom is not the white citizen's councillor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice." The ugliness of racism needs challenging by white people and recognising that what we will have to relinquish in assuring a healthy society. My argument is that we too have much to gain in doing so. Liberal is not only an ironic term, but it includes within it a longing for justice and equality, and it is those instincts we need to call upon. As Covell writes, racism, which diminishes its object to non-human status, also diminishes the perpetrator. All are losers by its terms. It does so in the final analysis by diminishing life, by reducing it to an abstraction, the better to manage it historically. And racism thereby becomes part of the wider problem of man's compact with the natural world in which he finds himself. When we white folk choose to stay blind, deaf, and silent concerning our own privilege and its impact on the Black other, we are opting to remain unconscious of a crucial aspect of our lives and of ourselves. This part of our shadow has been whitewashed out of view. But then what colours, what potential, what depth might we be missing? Given this, why do we persist in tolerating this lack which seems so central to whiteness? How do we manage so effectively to persevere in not seeing the implications for the society of which we are citizens? Why do we continue so doggedly with our ignorance? The tenacity of the problem suggests the political and the social has developed roots deep into the individual psyche. And it made me wonder how the baby who is born pink learns to become white. Recent research, mainly in the US, but also in Europe, shows that children recognize both the fact of difference and the inherent privilege in whiteness far earlier than is usually thought. In 1992, Troiner and Hatcher studied children in predominantly white primary schools in Britain. They found that race is a significant element in the lives of Black and white children, both in their social relationships and in their understanding of society. This is the case even where the Black children are in a small minority or indeed not present at all. In 2003, Phyllis Katz led a longitudinal study which followed 100 African American children and 100 European American children for their first 6 years. When the children were 3, they were shown photographs of other children and asked them to choose whom they would like to have as friends. Of the white group, 86% picked other white children. When they were between 5 and 6, Katz gave these children a small deck of cards with drawings of people on them. Katz asked the children to sort the cards into 2 piles any way they wanted, whereas only 16% split the piles on the basis of gender. 68% did so on the basis of race. This is a separate research project by Margaret Bill Spencer, which sort of reformed the famous Dole test, which you can find on the YouTube. Van Orsdell and Fegan studied 3 to 6-year-olds in an American urban nursery school using an observational research method. They found that children learnt to identify racial or ethnic markers, such as skin colour, and use them to gain social control, although such activities were curbed when adults were present. They write, children in this society learn at an early age that generally speaking, whiteness is privileged and darkness is not, and thus their choices in this regard are usually not surprising. Despite the fact that they only observed and recorded what occurred between children, Van Orsdell and Fegan experienced some hostility from white parents regarding their findings. They say, when most adults are confronted with evidence that their 3-year-olds are masters at managing racial ethnic relations, they often become disturbed, try to rationalize the evidence away, or dismiss the evidence as unique. They go on to say, this failure to acknowledge the importance of racial groups in children's lives arises from the twin adult convictions that children are naive and that colorblindness is not only desirable, but achievable. Frankly put, many white adults insist that racial distinctions do not matter, while all around them children see ample and compelling evidence that they do matter, and matter very much indeed. One practical response to this ideological contradiction by white children is to conceal the creation of their own racial understandings and relationships, at least while the prying eyes of adults are on them. This enables them to reproduce the racial ethnic hierarchy in their own relationships without interference from adults. The following is an example from Van Alstel and Fegan's observational study in the daycare centre. In this instance, Renee, who's 4 and white, is pulling Ling Mai, 3 and Asian, and Jocelyn, who's 4.5 and also white, across the playground in a wagon. Rennie tugs away enthusiastically, but the task is difficult. Pulling this heavy load across loose dirt is more than Rennie can handle. Suddenly she drops the handle, which falls to the ground, and stands still, breathing heavily. Ling Mai, eager to continue this game, jumps from the wagon and picks up the handle. As Ling Mai begins to pull, Renee admonishes her. No, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon. Renee has her hands on her hips and frowns at Ling Mai. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do this task. This is the breaking point, and adult intervention is now sought. Ling Mai sobs loudly and runs to a nearby teacher, complaining that Renee hurt my feelings. We see the child's discretion at work. She offers no more than hurt feelings to explain her actions to the teacher. Since intervention is in order, the teacher approaches Renee. Did you hurt Ling Mai's feelings? The teacher asks Renee, who glumly nods assent. This is a familiar ritual. I think you should apologize, the teacher continues, because we are all friends here, and friends don't hurt each other's feelings. Sorry, mutters Renee, not looking at Ling Mai. Ling Mai stands silently. The teacher waits for a few moments, then finishes with, okay, can you guys be good friends now? Both girls nod without looking at each other and quickly move away. The teacher stands and waits for a moment or two to assure herself that the conflict is not erupt again, and then moves off. Both Renee and Ling Mai have already worked out that racial identity and colour have powerful implications in social relations, and both recognise that Renee's words and actions are hurtful. However, both also seem to realise that the factor of race needs to be kept away from any involvement of an adult. Ling Mai did not reveal to the teacher that race was involved in the dispute, even though that would have got Renee into a lot more trouble, and in one sense, Ling Mai would have triumphed. But she may well have had enough experience of how white power operates to know that a temporary gain might not be worth longer-term punishment. Thus, whilst Renee had to apologise, her position is not challenged, and indeed is confirmed for them both. The common understanding of how children develop race awareness is that it is a bottom-up process, whereby the child notices physical differences between themselves and others, then hears derogatory comments about those who have a darker skin. Lawrence Hirschfield confronts this perception, positing instead that the process is more one that is top-down. He says the young child does not learn about race in isolation, but within the more global task of parsing the social world. This consists of attending to information that is relevant to the scope of the social groups that exist in the world. He goes on to say, given all this, it makes sense that young children adopt a top-down approach to acquiring information about the prevailing social ontology, relying on a learning strategy that focuses attention on the logic of the system, rather than worrying the details of individual identification. The child acquiring knowledge of race is in the business of acquiring knowledge of the kind of things of which society is composed, not a catalogue of corporal variation. The child growing up in a white liberal family comes to recognize that they are white and that there are black others not so privileged, without necessarily being clear about what physical characteristics are pertinent to either category. They are socialized into a world of white solipsism, where apart from the occasional exception, it is whites who are given the significant and interesting roles, whilst blacks are more often relegated to those of service, sport, music, or crime. Children need help to think about what they observed about the racist structures of society, and to connect their inherited privilege with a developing concern for fairness. They need a language for thought from which effective action can develop. However, many white adults become embarrassed, hush the child, ignore or distract them, or resort to the shortcut of colour blindness by insisting that everyone is the same and equal. Such an assertion is not only untrue and denies what the child has observed and experienced. By focusing on the universality of humans, the message is conveyed that it is the recognition of difference that is the cause of racism, rather than the fact that the child has been born into a social system that discriminates against certain groups, which they need help to acknowledge, understand, and begin to think through how they might respond. 4-year-old Renee has already grasped that there are groups within society who have power and privilege, and there are those who do not. She may not understand what the concepts white and American mean, but she does recognize that they can be used to exclude. She's incorporating whiteness as part of her identity and knows that this identity gives her power over the racial other. And most important, she acts on her understandings. The critical issue of group membership figures strongly in this incident. Rennie has also learned that this knowledge has to be kept secret from adults. When one knows something and yet all the messages from important adults are that it shouldn't be known, the psyche has to repudiate some or all of the meaning of reality. Internally, two conflicting situations develop, and in order that they can coexist, a vertical split is created within the psyche. This split is reflected in and reinforced by the wider social system, allowing both the reality of white privilege and its disavowal. In psychoanalytic theory, an internal conflict may lead to the creation of horizontal splits in the psyche, where aspects of the self are repressed, made unconscious, and denied. Outside of conscious awareness, these repressed elements of the psyche can have a damaging and conflictual impact on the individual's life and relationships. Whilst also a defensive process, disavowal develops within the ego when it is faced with two conflicting realities, causing a vertical split. Unlike repression, the individual remains conscious of both sides of the split, but will disavow either to meet internal desires and needs or minimize anxiety. Thus, I can know the reality of the consequences of my behavior, but will disregard that awareness in order to satisfy my desires, my omnipotence, and my narcissistic sense of entitlement. Disavowal features strongly in addiction, where the person is fully aware of the consequences of continuing their behavior, an awareness that will be put aside and ignored in the service of meeting the need for the drug of choice. It can be seen operating collectively and in individuals in relating to the climate emergency. The liberal narrative, which exacerbated perhaps by the purity that is embedded in the very notion of whiteness, abjures the realities of racism whilst also needing to maintain the privilege of the white skin. Thus, the white individual and the white collective has to maintain both white privilege and an acceptable perception of the self. The tension between these two positions is solved by disavowal. I suggest this vertical split as it relates to racism is not merely a single line dividing two parts of the psyche with the investment in white privilege and the racist thought on one side and the condemnation and rejection of racism on the other. On both sides, there remains a capacity for symbolization, which is lacking in certain moments when we are reminded of our racism. The internal psychic structure can be imagined as made up of two vertical layers, between which there is a gap, a silent, empty place devoid of symbols, in which it is impossible to play or to grieve. Adrian Harris states it may be that there is in whiteness a psychose blanche, named by Andre Green for quite other purposes. Deeper than depression, deeper than rage, there is a blankness, a place where there is not sufficient structure for mourning, where the psyche gives way. In most other aspects of her or his life, the white child in a modern liberal family can take their curiosity regarding the social milieu they seek to understand and find their place within to the significant adults in their life. For the majority of the time, their experience will be of lively engagement, attention, and interest. When they raise the matter of differences concerning race and ethnicity, and they are responded to with the sterility of a blanket colourblind position, the lively engaged presence they had known previously disappears, and they are faced with a blankness, a shutting down, and a silencing. There is a deadness which relates to the subject, and the child quickly learns that the topic is not welcome for discussion. Their curiosity and developing concern for others, their preoccupations with the troubled matter of social fairness, is shut down, and the vertical split of disavowal develops. Black parents will be far more alert to the fact of racism and the dominance of whiteness in the society in which their children are growing up, and will have to respond to and help reframe their children's experience. In 2007, a study of 17,000 American families with preschool children found that non-white parents are about 3 times more likely to discuss race with their children than white parents, 75% of whom never or almost never talk about race. White parents may feel they don't have to engage with the subject and indeed may feel uncomfortable in doing so. Both the confidence and sense of entitlement that comes with inhabiting a world which reflects you and your life, as well as a contract of silence about the disparities, is passed on from parent to child. A critical component of these processes of disavowal are the ways that white children learn to disconnect, to stop thinking, to stop noticing, to stop linking reality and history, and turn off their empathic curiosity and care. If allowed to develop this curiosity and care, it would cause problems for whiteness's power and the privileges it claims and protects, but will result in recognition of reality, which eventually might lead to responsibility taking and reparation. A few years back, I was presenting a paper on racism to an all-white group of therapists. A difficult and uncomfortable discussion followed, in which the group seemed collectively engaged in finding ways to avoid the emotional work of exploring their own racism. These included individuals separating themselves from the white group by asserting a different nationality, language, history, class, or age. Questions were asked as to why we were not focusing on sexuality, gender, class, or disability. All important subjects, but not the topic of the day. As it always does, the introduction of these other inequalities managed to flatten the discussion, so the subject of racism was in danger of disappearing altogether. Someone pointed out that Black people are racist too, managing to evade the critical matter of power differentials. The hostility towards me as the person raising the subject was palpable. It was a depressing but familiar event. After some time, a woman who'd been silent till then said she was thinking about an experience on her way to the seminar that day. She was waiting in her car at some traffic lights and another car pulled up beside her, driven by a woman dressed in a burqa. Looking across, the thought came to her, "Oh, so they can drive, can they?" She instantly pushed this thought away as she was aware of the racism behind it, but had been turning the memory over in her mind throughout the discussion. As someone who usually experienced no difficulty in speaking in groups, she was puzzled by what felt like a profound reluctance to bring this thought into the discussion. She recognized her own internal condemnation of the prejudice tied up in the thought, as well as a fear of external attack were she to give it voice. By recounting her thought to the group, who until then were firmly on the "I am not a racist" side of the vertical split, she articulated a reality from the other side. In my experience, three main possibilities were then open to the group. The first was to isolate and scapegoat the individual, so she carried alone all the guilt of having racist thoughts. The second was to normalize her response and wipe it clean of any racism, thus bringing her over to their side of the divide. The third, which fortunately was what happened in this particular group, was for her courage to give permission for others to recall similar instances in their own lives. The atmosphere shifted, the anxiety and the defensiveness became less intense, and the level of communication deepened. There emerged the chance of ownership of just a little of the destructiveness of our racism, allowing the possibility of grief. This dynamic played itself out in a group of individuals, but it might also be seen as an illustration of what occurs inside the psyche. Racist thoughts will arise in our minds, but they are likely to be quickly dismissed or even forgotten. This process of disavowal may mean we can preserve an internal sense of ourselves as good, but it perpetuates the ignorance that is such a central aspect of the maintenance of our white privilege and ensures nothing changes. As in the group, if the thought is surfaced and allowed, it becomes available for examination, and we deepen our understanding of how this social fact of whiteness affects and distorts our relationship to others in the world and to ourselves. Robin DiAngelo puts it thus: to increase the racial stamina that counters white fragility, we must reflect on the whole of our identities, and our racial group identity in particular. For white people, this means first struggling with what it means to be white. Adrian Harris writes, what is ironic and infuriating to many contemporary people of colour writing about racism is that the revelations and analysis of continuing racism by people of colour is not leading to work within the white community. I use the word work deliberately to mean the hard but necessary intellectual and emotional labour that will be essential to transform and unpack racism as it is lived and enacted among white persons. This is a way of suggesting that reparations, forgiveness, work across racial lines requires first work within white communities and individuals. Christina Sharp's powerfully moving book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, takes the three meanings of the word wake: the track left on the water's surface by a ship, a watch or vigil held beside the body of someone who has died, and the state of wakefulness, consciousness. Weaving in her personal history with film, photography, and art, she uses these meanings as a contemplation of how Black people live with the aftermath of slavery and the racism of the modern world. She contemplates the wake that was created as the slave ship journeyed from Africa to the Americas and the impunity with which enslaved Africans who were ill or weak or rebellious were thrown overboard. She expands the concept as a metaphor for the consideration of the suffering of Black people who lived their lives in the wake of the trade. Recovery requires mourning and what she calls wake work. Sharp, of course, is concerned with the disturbance that follows the centuries of slavery for Black people living today. But reading this impressive work, I found myself wondering if and how the concept might apply to whiteness. Our relationship to this painful history is very different, and so therefore is the work required. We who are descendants of the white people who sailed those ships, who invested in the trade, who profited from the trade and from colonialism, that is to say, all white people, need also to address the past, The whiteness of the waves created by the ships soon disappear. The waters close over the black African bodies and a flat calm restored. For the white bystander, no permanent visible scar remains. The ship may have passed, but without justice, without reparation, without collective grieving and the eradication of racism. The trauma of those times continues to be held in the generations of black descendants. White ancestral history, the role of the perpetrators, the impact on the victims, as well as the extent to which we profited and continue to profit, demands recognition. This history should be central to the curriculum taught to all our children. But for those of us whose education touched only lightly on the matter, it is our responsibility to educate ourselves now as adults. The second meaning of the term wake refers to its place in the process of mourning. We keep watch with the dead and grieve their passing. A wake is traditionally a collective activity which acknowledges that the death of one affects the whole. These are essential communal rituals, especially when a death is the result of a collective failure. For without them, the undigested, unmourned suffering of previous generations are passed down from generation to generation as phantom narratives that pervade our personal and social lives. For Black people who are the direct descendants of the enslaved, the grief is great. The idea that white people too need to mourn might seem odd, given that we have gained so much and apparently lost so little in the history of race. As we face the guilt of whiteness, past and present, we have to let go the myth of our white innocence and purity and not acknowledge the darkness at its heart. The privilege paid for by the blood of others has a toxicity at its root which corrupts the psyche. Terrible damage has been done and will continue to be done if we are to go on basing our economic and political ways of being on racist structures. Only by facing the pain and the guilt of the ancestors and of our inheritance, only by keeping vigil can we come anywhere near to laying the iniquities of slavery to rest. This brings us to the third meaning of the term wake, which is to wake up to the way the world is structured and to our personal part in it. For white people, this means a lifelong process of active commitment to examine and confront both internal and external activities that are based in prejudice and stereotypes which depersonalize and do harm to the Black others. It means listening with care when Black friends and colleagues tell us of their troubles without rushing to a defense of ourselves. It requires us to face our white fragility head on, engage in conversations, even though we risk getting it wrong. And when we do, we need to listen openly to understand how our words have caused hurt. We need to develop our resilience and challenge our fragile state. It demands a careful attention to the thoughts and responses that arrive in the mind, because their exploration will help us to see how the system of racism within which we live expresses itself in our minds. Because this system is based in our favour and privileges us, because part of that privilege is the invisibility of our whiteness, taking on this work requires us to make active, determined and ongoing choices. The fragility in whiteness that maintains that privilege keeps pulling us away from the discomfort that is inevitable if we are to fully engage in that exploration. We are required to build a stamina and a resilience in speaking about the subject if we are to genuinely support anti-racist activities. As he was walking to his London studio one day in the 1960s, the Guyanese artist Frank Bowling came across a large white swan trapped in a pool of oil from which it was struggling to fly free. Struck by the ferocious determination of the bird, Bowling painted sufficient versions of the image to fill the first room of the retrospective of his work at Tate Britain. As I stood before the canvas in the summer of 2019, I was struck by this picture of whiteness, caught as it was by the consequences of exploitations of the planet and of people. I saw within it something of the terrible damage done by whiteness since its inception in the 17th century, in its corruption of human relationships between each others and with the planet. Having to bear continual acts of racism, both extreme and subtle, is what the Black individual has to suffer and is the price they pay for my privilege. But it harms us all, and if I want to live in a world that is not divided, is not contaminated with the psychopathology of racism, where we re-find our connections, then I must acknowledge that the covenant of whiteness is my inheritance. Then I must decide what it means, what it costs, and whether I'm prepared to give it up. But I, for one, want my colour back. Thank you.
So, Helen, thank you very, very much indeed. We are going to now take a short break for 5 minutes and then come back and begin our discussion. So we're going to come back at about 2 or 3 minutes past 8, please. So perhaps you'd like to take your opportunity for a quick break now, and see you very soon. Thank you. We're now going to start our discussion, and I'm going to invite people to comment or reflect or make observations to begin our conversation. Please use the raised hand function on your Zoom, which is somewhere on your device, and I will let you in to speak in sequence. I would just ask, given the number of people who probably want to contribute, to keep your interventions concise, please. Thank you very much. So I'm inviting Chris Perry to get us underway.
Helen, that was one of the most disturbing and stimulating talks I've ever heard. Thank you for that. I'm speaking as a member of the Society of Analytical Psychology, where we have no Afro-Caribbean or Black, so-called Black members. And also I'm speaking from my experience of 10 years of working at the Paddington Centre for Psychotherapy, which was located in North Kensington and consisted of 3 departments, one for children and parents, one for adults, and a day hospital. And we could not, although we were in the heart of an Afro-Caribbean community, we could not attract those members of the community into our services. And this was profoundly disturbing for us all. And we never understood why. And also on a much more personal note, and now I'll shut up, I've only been referred to Afro-Caribbean clients in my entire working career, and I did not manage to work with them out of my fear. That's what I think the reason was. So I'd be glad for any comments you have about that.
Okay. Thank you. So, okay, so I'm inviting Sam to speak.
Am I unmuted now? I think I am.
I think you are.
I just want to echo Christopher and say thank you for that, Helen. It was very thought-provoking, and I thought the slides were a really nice accompaniment, actually, sort of a good way of sort of stimulating the thinking. I thought what Christopher, you were saying about the struggling to work with those clients or patients out of fear sort of made me think a bit about what Helen was saying about the idea of a gap in the psyche that leads to a blankness, which really resonated very strongly for me, because I think that's the experience so often whenever I try and think about race and have conversations like this, that there is a blankness and a deadening effect. And I also liked what you said, Helen, about there being no space for mourning or play. And I wonder whether the difficulty of you're working with those patients, Christopher, was that for me, I find it very hard to know how to address the topic, and it's quite hard to be playful, and we need to be playful in order to think about this stuff. And this is an area and a topic where playfulness and curiosity are absolutely stifled, I think, and numbed, and feel incredibly worrying. So I just wanted to sort of share those thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'm asking the next person with a raised hand whose name I don't have to unmute, if I can. Yeah. Hello, you're now unmuted. I don't know your name, I'm sorry.
I'm calling Hunter, and what I found it very interesting, and I thought, I think that was really, really good. The comment I would like to make is when it comes to the kind of history of Black people, particularly Black people, in around America and Britain, it usually starts with slavery. That period of time, without the kind of mention that, Black people were part of the community before that, from the Romans, etc. And in order for slavery to happen, they really had to dehumanize Black people in order to kind of justify it. And I feel that this is why it's taking so long to come back from it, in terms of what needed to be done, for the whole cycle to ensure that.
Sorry, can I just say that you're quite hard to hear? There's something not quite right with your microphone or something. So, yeah.
Oh, hold on.
Do keep going. Now you need to unmute, Pauline.
You see, it's like an enactment.
Yeah, sorry,
of what
can you
we're
hear me
talking
now?
about.
Yeah, that's better.
Sorry about that. So what I was saying, to kind of summarize what I was saying before, is the history of Black people, particularly around Britain, it always tends to start around slavery. And it ignores the fact that, Black people were in Britain long before that, even with the Roman times, with Black Romans being buried in York, from going back that far. And the way, in order to kind of justify and do slavery, they had to really, really dehumanize Black people. So it's not even, in terms of by the time it got to slavery, Black people were then kind of categorized as animals, so that they can justify trading of, animals rather than treating us like humans. So therefore, this is, I think, the reason what people don't realize, that this is why it comes back. It's not so much a matter of, in a way, kind of like white privilege. It's a matter of, are Black people, the fact that are Black people now being treated equal from a human point of view. And I think that this is when people realize what had to happen in order to justify slavery, I think it might be better, easier to see how far we need to really go for Black people to be considered human.
Thank you. So I want to come now to the speaker who has a white circle with what looks like an image of a Black woman in the middle.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. Just a point to Christopher, when you say Afro-Caribbean, a preferred way of saying that would be African Caribbean. Afro is a hairstyle. It's not a person. With regards to the talk, very interesting. What I heard from the talk mainly was whiteness as it's spoken about this evening, and I think in many other areas, has a tendency just to recognise Black trauma in that trauma porn way. It doesn't really recognise levels of what Black people have achieved in and of ourselves, in our own communities, in our own histories, in our own countries. So just to recognise 5 out of 10 can't do this and 5 out of 10 can't do that. Don't recognise a successful Black middle class. It doesn't recognise all the values and things that we hold. That's the problem I really had with this talk, really. It was quite trauma porn.
Okay. Thanks. I mean, Helen will have a chance to comment towards the end, but I'm coming now to Prudencia.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much, Helen. Can you hear me clearly? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Helen, for your presentation. Yeah, it was really useful, really helpful to hear about. I suppose I hear it, and I feel, for me personally, as an African a person of African heritage, it doesn't recognize Black people. There's white privilege and there's Black recognition. I'm not looking, or no, it's not about me, but I don't think that people of color are looking for a hand up as such, hand up to the table. There's something about being there before, being there original, being there at the beginning. And I really hear this matter of the trauma porn. That really resonates with me, as if we're always in a place of deficit. I think that this space is really useful. I hope it doesn't descend into a place where, you know, it's a tit for tat type thing, because I think this is really useful. But I don't apologize for where I am, where I'm going, where I was, where I am, where I will go in the future. I feel that it's useful for people to recognize that the peoples on the planet were not originally white. They were not, and I can't study my particular field in that vein. I have to think in terms of the whole history of the world, and Africans do play a significant part in that. It's just that through social anthropological lenses, we're seen as catching up, but actually we were there already. So there's a lot of work to be doing. I really appreciate Helen's contribution, because if nothing else, it helps to educate those who are deluded into thinking that their whiteness is an original thing. It's not. You have to make room for those who were there before you, and actually whiteness is what would I say? What could I say? Whiteness is it's a humanity thing. We are humans. We are humans first, and the humans comes from a place of the hue. And there's something about the history of mankind. So but I do appreciate the space. And I thank Helen. I really do thank Helen, and I'm looking forward to getting the book as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm coming to John Ahern, who I think was next in the queue now.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I was just actually just looking at, as Prudencia was speaking, I was looking at how the numbers of people just significantly dropped off. And I wondered, is that part of people not really wanting to hear what was being said? The numbers of participants really dropped off very sharply there. What I was going to say was about relation to Sam and Christopher and their comments on how do we work with Black people. My training, there was a whole load of work on race, and it made people incredibly uncomfortable. The whole group there was 15 of us. This is a level 4 diploma in integrative counselling. There was 15 of us. There was only one Black person in our training. You know, there was some very, very uncomfortable moments, but in terms of acknowledging that there are differences, these differences exist, that there is prejudice, that there is racism, and something that I've taken out of it, I was taught by the two top tutors were Black, and what I do in the therapy room is I address difference if there is a difference, whether that be gender, age, particularly colour. I will say, I'm a white man, you're a Black woman, is that okay? And how do you think we'll be able to work together? And just the fact that I've addressed it, there's some power differential reduction there. And that's the feedback I've had, and that's what I wanted to contribute. And Helen, thanks ever so much. Great talk.
Thank you very much. I'm coming now to a speaker who I can't see and who has a white on black symbol on his or her screen. I'm asking them to unmute. Hello?
Hello?
Would you like to turn your camera on?
No, I'm okay. My voice is quite bad at the moment. So I wanted to say I really appreciate Helen's talk, but like how the rest of the Black women have said as well, I completely agree what they're saying. The point is with the whiteness, and as well as like what media portrays with white supremacy, the perfect example is what's happening in USA at the moment. Now, what happened on 6th of January clearly states from when someone's protesting, stating that Black Lives Matter, compared to like literally going into a White House or something like similar to a parliament, and it's okay. Like they weren't arrested. There hasn't been any arresting or anything. I think Helen's PowerPoint is useful, but there needs to be more spoken about it. So it's almost like when someone has a racist comment or view, and it's like saying, oh, so even like one of Helen's comment was a lady was wearing a burqa, and how they can drive as well. It's almost like to state that situation, not just analysis view, they can be very like psychoanalytical as well as counselling view as well. So it's almost taking that pinpoint of that almost racist comment, because you're literally commenting on someone who's wearing a burqa. Can they drive or can they not drive? There needs to be a lot more addressed to that. And it's not just as well with trauma. There's a lot more issues that are like hidden, especially when it comes to whether it's Black lives or even Muslims as well. But I think as well, like discrimination as well as racism, there isn't just a fine line. It's almost like it's all related to one. Sorry if my voice sounds very strange. It's quite difficult to talk. But like I said as well, Helen's talk was very, very useful. But there needs to be more addressed when it comes to whiteness, especially whiteness as an issue as well.
Okay, thank you. So I'm moving next to Kenisha, who I think is unmuted now.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Helen, for the presentation. I was very interested in Christopher's contribution, which was the first contribution, because I'm about to embark on some research looking at the underrepresentation of children and families accessing CAMHS services. And I'm very interested in understanding what's happening there. It's not just about these children and families accessing services, but also those who are delivering the service. There seems to be a barrier in professionals being able to access, first of all, training and then some employment at those professional levels. So I wanted to think about how trauma can be understood by the Black community, not just by the Black community, but also by professionals, whoever they may be. And I came to this subject because, as we know, there was quite a pandemic before this pandemic, with a lot of knife crime happening in London in the Black community, but very few referrals coming into CAMHS services to address this matter, to offer some therapeutic intervention to the families of either the perpetrators or victims, and wondering what was happening there. Why was this not being sort of looked at and picked up as a type of trauma? You know, somebody doesn't just become a murderer overnight. Something has definitely been happening long before that. And it's usually young people, but what's happening to Black children before they become adolescents? What's happening in primary school? And something's being missed because we get to, you know, adult males filling the mental health wards and the inpatient wards. So something is happening along the way and something is being missed, and how we can start to look at this and address what's happening in the community. I was really interested in somebody commenting in the chat about whether there might have been a mutual fear. Christopher, you know, openly and honestly said that he was fearful, and I wonder about the fear on the other side, coming from the Black community, where some families may fear being judged or criticised, or will they be subject to unconscious biases when they present with a problem or a challenge that they need help with, whereas perhaps their white counterparts could see it as a service that's available to them, that they could access quite freely and seek that help voluntarily, in some cases, self-referrals, where often maybe members of the Black community are signposted, and sometimes it's more on sort of, you know, compulsory requirement, maybe from social care or something like that. So they're approaching the service, if they do approach the service at all, maybe from a different point of view, not from a point of view of an entitlement as a service that's available to me and my family to offer some help and support, but as perhaps something else, going along quite reluctantly and not necessarily confident that there are people on the other side that would be able to help and support them. So thinking about how families can access, but also engage and sustain long enough engagement to do a good piece of work to progress to better relations, whether it's children, families, or adults.
Thank you so much. So I'm coming now to Mel B, asking you to unmute and speak, please.
Hello there. My name is actually Fred. My wife is Melby.
That's me.
So I have a comment and a question that revolves around, I guess, white supremacy in general. And first of all, it seems that whenever, and I think there's a history here, whenever we have these sort of discussions, it largely leans on the victimization of Black people as a reference, as a point of reference, and in order to evaluate white privilege and white supremacy. Rather, I have a question about that from the other side of that dynamic. What is it about whiteness that makes it such a strong investment? Why is there so much investment in whiteness for white people? What does it do for you or them as you know, to be white? And and how do you view yourselves in the world? And yeah, so what's the impact on the individual as well as the group?
Right, thank you. I'm trying to follow also the quite complex discussions going on in the chat, but I've also got to concentrate on just allowing people in. So I'm coming next to Myra.
Hi, yeah, it's Myra, but thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Helen. There's a couple of points I want to make, which I'm a counsellor, I'm a therapist myself, and I teach power, privilege, oppression, diversity and inclusion and intersectionality as well to therapists. And in what you were speaking about, Helen, I keep coming back to this idea about, or this thought rather, or the theme of whiteness in the profession. I think so often we think about whiteness existing out there, but of course the profession, the therapy profession itself, does not exist in a vacuum separately to the rest of the world, to the rest of society. So the profession reflects the same power dynamics and privileges that exist out there. They exist in here within the profession. With that in mind then, if we're acknowledging that the power and privilege and oppression exists out there, it therefore then exists in here within the profession. And I'm thinking then about who creates the spaces within the profession, both within professional spaces, and that also then includes the training spaces as well, the space of the curriculum and what gets included in that. And then that has a direct repercussion into the type of spaces that are then created in the therapy room itself. So the idea of power and privilege and oppression existing within the profession, it has a ripple effect that goes from out there to in here of the profession, trailing from that top-down approach from professional bodies to training institutions to training courses and curriculums, and then ultimately exists within the therapy room. Interestingly, there is a big call now for there to be better training and curriculums and resources now for these types of topics to be taught more competently in therapy training. It's what I call kind of cultural humility. But what I suppose the thought I'm left with based on what you were talking about, Helen, is that when those splits, those vertical splits occur, actually the very thing we are calling for actually hits up against the very suppression, repression, denial, the shutting down of wanting to have these conversations. And so I think we're actually sat in a very precarious position right now within the therapeutic profession, which is consciously, perhaps cognitively, we want to say we want better training in it. But actually, I think the spaces, the therapeutic spaces, the training spaces that are then created are there to actually uphold the white privilege and power. And so are going to be in direct conflict with that cultural humility training, with these kind of spaces being created. As somebody who does deliver this training then, Helen, you speak about that, that experience of going into a room full of white therapists and going, right, well, today's topic is talking about whiteness. As a visible Muslim woman of South Asian heritage, South Asian and East African heritage, imagine me then going into these white spaces and teaching this, and the and how I'm related to in therapists wanting to have these discussions, but also in how challenged they are. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge, because I think it's far more comfortable for us to say that actually exists out there, but not in here within the profession. And I think it's really important that we start to have these conversations that whiteness does not disappear within the profession, because I think it's far more easier and far more comfortable to talk about the other, working with Black clients or communities, working with Muslim communities or clients. But when do we ever sit and talk about working with white clients? So I think it's really important that we start to acknowledge that both sides of that power, privilege and oppression spectrum need to be talked about and taught within the profession, but to acknowledge that it's proactive within the profession itself. But thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. I mean, what you say seems to me to really lead us back in a way to some of the things that Helen was trying to get at, which is what difference might it make if white people did feel able confidently to take on some of these tasks? Well, I'm just noticing that someone has put in the chat, power isn't addressed in courses, so whiteness is almost never safe to address. Name it at your peril. I don't know whether we are making it safe to think about or address tonight or not, but I'm just making that observation. But I'm coming now to Manshot and asking you to speak, please.
Hello, thank you for letting me speak. I just want to say thank you very much to Helen for a very interesting, very bold paper, and really happy to be here to hear that paper today. Quite moving in many ways, was quite touched by it. One of the first point I wanted to make was that I was quite concerned about the number of people leaving the group when they've committed to coming from 7 to 9 and what that was about. I would even imagine, maybe this is me, but I imagine that a lot of people who are leaving are white people, and I don't want to say anything more about that, but I just have a question about whether this is about discomfort and whether we can stay with the discomfort that this paper brings up, and how many people can stay with that, and how important that is to stay with the discomfort, without which we cannot grow. As we know, if we're all therapists, we cannot grow from anything without discomfort, and how important that is. And the other point I wanted to make was that, and I have tried in my work as council member on my psychotherapy organisation to make some changes, including having anti-racism stance. It has been ultra difficult, and I wondered why it was so difficult, and I wonder whether it was easier for a white person like Helen Morgan to talk about it than it would be for me, for example, and what that means, and the meaning of that. I would be wondering whether it's because of my South Asian background, and why is that so, and whether that's another form of a power imbalance that I am experiencing at the moment. And I'm totally aware of Thinking Spaces by Frank Lowe, and Frank, I was part of the TAVI at the time, and I'm just thinking about these issues and about the training, how it comes down to our training and after training, and the color blindness of the training is quite scary, actually quite almost lethal to people who come out of there completely feeling abused. I think with Mira, you said racism is abuse. I'm absolutely agreeing with that, and I think completely abused and traumatized as well from a training that has never recognized any literature about racism or any experience that they cannot even put into words sometimes, and the microaggressions and all of those issues that are all the time present in their lives, and then to go to a training to re-experience all of it and then get pathologized by a supervisor, by a therapist on top of that. It's quite a horrible position to be, and I have come across people who've been through that, and quite a few in fact, and I think unless this is addressed in utmost urgency, we're going to repeat everything, going to repeat the abuse, you're going to repeat the trauma, and we need to, and I think that something about that abuse and the safeguarding that somebody talked about is so crucial now, and we cannot just say that it's just the outside world. As psychoanalytic therapists, we cannot just say the outside world does not come into the inside world, and the inside world does not have a space to have a reaction about it, and that's all down to the black person or the Asian person that their reaction is a chip on their shoulder. I know that talk very well, and I think it's extremely uncomfortable issues. And you know, we as therapists train to bear the unbearable. And why are we not able to do that as a profession, as a collective voice? Why can't we have a voice together, white and black and Asian and whoever, you know, all together? And we know there's so much research being done in Africa and not in Africa about our DNA, that we actually come, our DNA is sometimes 90% white, and that's from white people. And can they come to terms with that their DNA is actually coming from the black people? I mean, I don't understand that. I don't understand why this cannot. The split is so enormous about the thinking, and Beyond talks about the attacks on thinking and the attacks on linking. And I think, why can't we use these theories in our everyday work? Why aren't we doing that? It's absolutely amazing. It's like going through treacle every time to talk about these things. And I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. We've got about 12 minutes left if we're to give Helen a chance to respond. I've got about 10 people lined up, so I just ask you to stay aware of that. Fiona, please do come in.
Oh, well, I'll try and keep it concise. Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much, because I think it was quite important for me to attend this particular session, because a lot of the similar discussions that I've attended over the last year, it tends to be a lot of Black people talking or Asian people talking. And I find that when we're talking about these issues and the challenges of these issues, there's a lot of silence from white people. The previous speaker, I think, to answer some of the question, is really about power. How easy is it, if power is attributed to your race, how easy is it to give that up or to share that power? And I think that's what it is. That's what I feel now it's come to, because although we've had all the experiences that happened last year, and that's not anything new, it's been happening for decades. The challenging of oppression, or just wanting basic rights, or being treated fairly. You know, if you've got a child, for example, at school who may have signs of autism, that child being entitled to have an assessment with an educational psychologist, as opposed to just being labelled a bad child. These are some of the things, not being able to see the vulnerability in children, but just label them bad. You know, the impact that has on, you know, that, we get told that we're not good enough, but then you get your education in these establishments here in England, and your qualifications are still not good enough. You know, you get, you know, so it's like, when is it ever good enough so that you can be treated fairly and have fair access to, whether it's employment, whether it's access to healthcare? What does it really take? You know, so I don't think we're going to be able to sum up everything, but I think the impact this has on people, it really does impact on generations to come. And I don't have all the solutions, but what I do think is very important for you know, for these debates to continue, for white people to do those discussions amongst themselves and really have a true reflection around, you know, answering some very uncomfortable questions, and not always seeking to get the solutions from your Black or Asian colleagues about their experiences. It's actually educate yourself. No one educates us or prepares us to deal with racism. You know, there isn't any training course out there about how to survive racism in a toxic work environment. So I will just leave it at that. But I know there have been some people mention saying that they find it difficult to recruit Black people or Asian people in. My background is social work, sorry, but if you could message me, I'd be very appreciative if there are opportunities, because there are many of my colleagues who have studied psychology or have got their masters have found a brick wall when it comes to getting learning experiences, you know, and they often have to then change their career direction, because even though they have the grades, for whatever reason, they are still seen as not good enough. So if there is anyone, please just message me, and we can have another conversation about that. So that's as much as I want to say. Okay, I'm going to put my email in the box.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Devin, please come in. Devin, Gaia House, please come in. Unmute, please.
Oh, thank you. I can now. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Helen, for your talk. I actually partly felt moved to raise my hand when I realised that in scanning the faces at the beginning of the meeting, how many people were white, and then how many people who were actually putting their hand up to talk were of colour, and I kind of felt a bit embarrassed and felt that yeah, I wondered why that was, and I guess probably because people were feeling uncomfortable, and I felt uncomfortable at the thought of putting my hand up, and I just feel it's so important that we're willing to feel uncomfortable, and I really appreciate that people are willing to stay with this and do this work. You know, it's work to face that discomfort. It's our natural human quality to just avoid discomfort, and we as white people need to do this work. We need to be educating ourselves. We need to be staying with it, even if it's difficult. You know, and if we think that somebody expressing themselves is an attack on us, well, let's just not watch that thought. You know, I don't think we need to just log out. And I would like to thank everyone who's participated and had the courage to speak, and particularly, you know, if you are taking responsibility, that some people have questioned, you know, what white people's role in this. Well, you know, I think, you know, racism is it's white people perpetuating racism, and you know, so I'm really grateful people like Helen are willing to put their head above the parapet and speak their truth, and I hope other white people will be willing to share their experiences and their racism. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that there aren't more white people who are up for speaking, and I'm sorry I don't have more time to contribute, but I think I should keep this short because I know there's at least another half a dozen people. So thank you all.
Okay, thanks. Doreen.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to try and be really quick. I think that there is a danger in individuals' responses and institutions' responses of short-term optics over actual long-term meaningful change. And there's an emphasis on dodging cancel culture and avoiding the wrath of that and appearing to be saying the right things. And I think we have to talk about Tavistock and Portman as an institution who are hosting this event. I'd like to be a psychotherapist and have been going to lots of open evenings and trying to learn more. And the cost of the training is unbelievable. And I've learned that child and adolescent psychotherapists are overwhelmingly middle class or upper middle class, white and female. And just as an example, the institution claims to want to change that, but there aren't scholarship options. There aren't, it's so expensive. I'm sure many of you know it's unbelievably expensive. And I think those two things cannot coexist. You can't really want to change the people in that profession and then we've been talking about people uptake within the community. How are we going to have that if there's nobody who looks like them, nobody who has, you know, nobody who has a relatable experience? So yeah, I think that's important to think about. I think real changes over the span of several generations takes a long time, and yeah, I think short-term optics need to be the least important thing. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very, you know, incisive points, I think. So, Alex.
Thank you. Really fascinating talk, Helen. Thanks so much for that. I found it really moving in many parts, actually. So many things have been said that I sort of have been kind of stirred up by. But I'll try again to be brief. A couple of things that Helen said, racism diminishing life. That really struck me. And also this figure of 75% of white parents never discussing race with their children. That really hit home to me. I've got 2 children, and the idea that race isn't something that you would discuss with a child seems to me to be just bizarre, in fact, especially living in Britain and particularly living in London. I cannot imagine that. And it seems to really speak to this problem, the idea of the split that Helen mentioned, and the kind of chasm between two sides, and that image has stayed with me through a lot of the comments that people have made. The last one about the Tavistock really was another one that hit home. I've studied there, and this idea about organisations wanting to change, wanting to open up to everybody in the community and to reflect the community is all fantastic as a kind of mission statement. But in fact, what you come across when you actually meet the organisations, nice though everybody is within them, I might say, but I do really feel that at an organisational level, there is definitely a disconnect, and that chasm between the two sides, the split, I think is very apparent when you engage with organisations. Certainly in the UK, I don't have experience of America, but it really rings very true. So that really stayed with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm asking Vivian to come in. I'm very conflicted. I think this may have to be the last intervention if we're to allow Helen a short time to make some comments in return.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Helen. And I really liked, there was a comment in the chat now from Lemis about discomfort as a form of learning. And I think this has been my sort of journey over my life, really, in terms of race and owning my whiteness, because I'm from South Africa and from a background, obviously, as a white person of immense privilege. And I've carried shame and guilt about being a white South African throughout my sort of adolescence and early life. And I worked in politics in South Africa with the ANC, and I sort of saw this as a way to relieve myself of the burden of my whiteness and the racist heritage that I was brought up in. And when I moved to the UK, which again, I was privileged to do, and I was privileged to get leave to remain, I refused to really socialize with other South Africans as a way of sort of avoiding my heritage and my whiteness. And I think it took me time here, and actually through my training, that I was able to begin to think about owning my whiteness. And I think that's why it is important for white people to talk about whiteness and own their experience, their background, and their privilege. But then for me, the other side of it is about acting, because it's no good for me to own and sort of sit with the discomfort and the knowledge of who I am. But then it's also about what do I do about it, because there's no point to my white guilt if I can't act on it. And so I think for me, particularly in the past year at work with colleagues, trying to think about what it means to act in a therapy setting, to challenge ideas about disengagement from people of colour who don't attend sessions because, well, we don't actually ask, and starting to think about what's it like to ask and what's it like to think about with the people that we see, about what it's like to sit in a room with a white therapist who you might think doesn't understand you, and also to be able to hear what people do say about that experience without feeling defensive. So for me, the sort of moving forward is about acting, being able to know and own, and then to act and not just sit with the guilt, because that feels sort of pointless and self-pitying, which is not helping me or anybody else. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much. I really apologise to people who've been queuing. I want to finish more or less on time. I think it's right that we do give Helen some chance to just comment at this stage.
Oh, goodness me, Andrew. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion. I mean, and thank you ever so much for people's contribution. I'm not going to comment on the powerful pieces people wrote about, spoke about in terms of trauma porn and the positive black images and realities, because I can't write about, I can't talk about blackness. I haven't got an authority to speak on that position. I can only talk about whiteness. I think black people clearly have a huge experience from very early on of whiteness. I think black people know a lot more about whiteness than we do. I think for white people, it's actually it's not been a long, it's a fairly recent discussion about actually acknowledging that whiteness is a thing. And I think we know we are pretty ignorant. We do probably, it suits us to be ignorant. So my interest is only about whiteness, really. Now that obviously has implications, that brings in topics around blackness, and I recognize that. And I get that wrong sometimes. But and Bhavna's question about why did I do it? It wasn't really research. It was writing a book, and it came from a whole, probably wanting just to know more about myself, recognizing there was a whole area of myself that had never been addressed, never been thought about, never been talked about. And so it sort of offered, and black people are very welcome to read it, but really for other white people in terms of that exploration. Mary's point about the profession, I absolutely take. I think actually I'd say I'd go further. I think we don't just reflect the society we live in. I think there are certain aspects of our profession, certainly in psychoanalysis and Jungian analysis. We've got two particular problems. I think one is our insistence on the division between inner and outer, and the separation of the individual from the collective. So I think Fahad Dalal talks about a false distinction between child development and child socialization. So we keep saying racism's got nothing to do with what we talk about, and which of course is defensive. And then there's the myth of the complete analysis. There's something about, for us, if you've been in therapy as part of your training analysis, there's some idea that, well, I've done all that, which is not true, because, and particularly when white people are in analysis with white people, the vertical split can coincide. So often a lot doesn't get picked up in the analysis around our own racism. It doesn't emerge. It certainly didn't in my analysis. And our founders, Freud and Jung, I mean, if you explore into their roots, their theories really were very much rooted in the armchair titans, the anthropologists of the Victorian anthropologists of the 19th century. And we really need to do a complete rehaul and a re-examination of a lot of our terms. The most obvious one would be the primitive. If we start pulling apart what that means, where it comes from, what its roots are, it's all very suspect stuff. And there's an awful lot of work this profession has to do, I think, to really examine itself and address the problems within it. And I absolutely take your point, Mira, that I mean, as well as the money side, I can't get that as well, but I think there's a lot of work this profession has to do, and it has to do it seriously, not just put banners up saying we support Black Lives Matter and things like that. So I think there's an awful lot of work whiteness has to do. But anyway, I'm leaving it there, Andrew, because I'm very aware of it.
Okay. Well done at 1 minute past 9. So I just want to note, sort of scanning the chat, that this inevitably will have been a very, very incomplete conversation, and there are many, many layers of discourse and discussion and difference and a degree of conflict about this evening and about how satisfactory it was or how much has been addressed, all there in the chat. But we do have to close. I mean, if anybody, I think, wants to communicate with us about some way of continuing a space like this, we'd be very interested to hear. I can't promise anything, but we've had two very, very large events now. There's clearly a hunger for a space like this. We of course would be willing to think about some further events, but I can't say what form it might take. But I want to thank everybody who's participated, everybody who's listened and been actively engaged, and I sense, you know, still upwards more than 500 people are. That's great. Yes, people have disappeared, but 500 have remained engaged. So I do thank everyone, and Helen as well, for tonight's event. And I wish you good night and to be well.